Hi, this is Mark Keller. I am presenting my selected work of art for Art History 201 for Professor Dusnap. My selected work is Madonna and Child by Duccio di Buonisegna from the late medieval period, around 1290 to 1300. And this is on display in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So this comes from the late medieval period, so it's butting up to the end of our study. And I think it's an interesting piece kind of for that because it's a motif that's consistently used dating back to the early Middle Ages, especially in Byzantine or Eastern Christendom. Um, and then you kind of trace it through the Middle Ages, this scene, and then past the Middle Ages into the Renaissance and into the Baroque and even into maybe contemporary art. There's even earlier depictions of this kind of this subject, this deity and child, like that of Horus and Isis. So here we have Horus and Isis, the statuette of Isis with infant Horus, from sometime between 733 and 525 BCE. This is in Egypt, but it's a similar subject here depicted in Egyptian mythology of Isis nursing and protecting her son Horus. There's several statues that depict this same scene, but it's a almost similar kind of story here, and there's a redemption idea behind Horus needing to take back Egypt as the rightful king, and the importance of Isis in nurturing and keeping this infant healthy and safe. And more importantly, though, we can trace it through the medieval era here. So here we have, in analyzing the images of the Madonna and Child throughout medieval European history, we can trace some of the cultural, religious, social, technical, stylistic trends over time. So here we have an early medieval Byzantine painting on a wood panel from the 6th century. And this was housed in a monastery in Egypt. So this is the icon of the enthroned Virgin and Child with saints and angels in St. Catherine's Monastery. And we'll come back to this image a little bit later for comparison purposes. But if we take a jump into the future here, we have the Madonna and Child by Filippo Lippi. This is rooted firmly in the Renaissance here, 1450 to 1465. So we see a lot of those stylistic changes here. We have focal point perspective. We have a very strong foreground and background. Using focal point perspective, the background's elaborate, has kind of its own elements of landscape painting to it. The painting's much more naturalistic and has an emphasis on the anatomical, realism. These markers of Renaissance art. So I think we actually see more in common stylistically between that early medieval Madonna and Child and Duccio's, even though they're separated by roughly 700 or so years, whereas Duccio's Madonna and Child is abutting right up to this Renaissance period of beginning sometime in the 14th century. So much closer in chronological time frame, but I think vastly different in their stylistic appearance. So if we go back to the Madonna and Child's by Duccio here, the purpose is really important. The purpose is it's a devotional, so it's a piece of art that's used to aid an individual in increasing their own personal relationship with God. So it's tiny. It's about the size of a sheet of notebook paper. It's 11 inches by 8.25 inches. It could be transported. Unlike many of the icons that we would see in early Byzantine churches depicting huge scenes that were meant for public view, this is one that is meant for an individual. And stylistically here, we have a flat image. It's two-dimensional. We don't see that foreground and background. The background is the gold leaf there that denotes that Byzantine influence. And it's a common motif in medieval art, as we said, this scene, but Western Europe sees a marked increase seen in the late Middle Ages in which this one was created. And Duccio had created several of these scenes, probably for other individuals as well. So it's clearly situated here in that medieval tradition and religious framework of Catholicism as opposed to Orthodox Christendom or Byzantine, even though you see that influence. So it's created right at the end of the era of the European Crusades, which makes sense for that increased influence of the Byzantine. So it's a time of cultural diffusion, syncretism, after many years of intellectual and artistic stagnation in Europe, at least in the realm of painting. I know you wouldn't say there's artistic stagnation if you're looking at Gothic architecture, but if you take, for instance, that early medieval depiction of the Madonna and Child and then compare it to this one 700 years later, you still see a lot of similarities in color, scale, anatomy, realism, naturalism that isn't quite there. As far as composition is concerned, it's uncluttered. Mary takes the clear center of this piece. There's some asymmetry here with the size of Jesus, notably his small head compared to his body. The red and deep blue provide strong contrast while also standing out clearly from that gold background, so the use of color seems very intentional. And a side note on that, the use of color is the skin pigmentation of both Jesus and Mary being darker, especially if you look at the hands of Mary and the face of Jesus, more historically accurate than many of the European-dominated images that you would see from the same period, in which you have a much lighter complexion to both of these figures, which might also have something to do, again, with this cross-cultural influence of the end of the Crusades. Sometimes the scene is depicted as part of a series, the Annunciation, the announcement of the birth of the Christ to Mary, so that she is pregnant with him. The nativity scene, the one that we see around Christmas, of the stable, and then the Madonna and Child, this era of Mary carrying, birthing, and rearing Jesus in a time in which she has this huge responsibility of caring for some God on earth. But in this late medieval tradition, I think we're seeing more of a direct connection and tenderness and nurturing quality as compared to some of those earlier Byzantine. So especially if we're looking at that connection, that gaze between the two. And then if we look, for instance, back at the early medieval, there's almost a fierceness to Mary in this depiction, right? Sense of determination, a position of authority and seriousness for her role. And then if you look at the image of Mary and Jesus together, they're not making a connection with each other, really. It's hard to see if they're making a connection with the viewer. It looks almost as if Jesus is looking outward. But it almost looks like they're sitting for a portrait, like an aristocrat sitting for a portrait or something. So there's that lack of tenderness and nurture that you see in that late medieval through Duccio here. So you have Mary gazing at her child, possibly knowing what the future holds. You can see the sadness in her face. The hand of the baby Jesus tugging at the shroud. It's an intimate gesture, but it's also maybe one that some art historians argue, foreshadow the burial shroud. I think all of this is important also in terms of iconology, that shift away from the more serious-looking Mary to the more nurturing-looking one. So I think this piece, in terms of iconology, I think it represents a deeply religious society, pretty obviously, but one that's also yearning for some sort of personal connection to their faith at the time. So this is a time in the Catholic Church when it was about to enter into a significant crisis of the 14th century. A time when we see many devotees feeling alienated by church services and masses that they couldn't understand because they're not in their language. Lack of access to the written text of the Bible. Lack of access to authentic spiritual experiences led them to look for other ways to engage. So this is also a time roughly around when you start to see, for instance, rosary beads start to be used. Rosary beads being the beads on the string that you would count as you said your daily prayers. It was tactile, and it provided some sort of personal connection between you and the metaphysical, as did this piece as a devotional. So the purpose of it itself is important for understanding the time, but also the way that the artist conveys, especially Mary emoting. She feels very human, approachable, empathetic, nurturing, maybe solemn or even heartbroken. Feelings that would resonate with, or maybe even deepen the owner of this piece, because it was meant for an individual. Deepen the owner's relationship maybe with their connection, with their faith or the metaphysical or whatever it was that they were working on. All right, so that's my probably very long presentation. So thanks for sticking with me, and I'm looking forward to learning more about this image.